Full disclosure, I'm a longtime fan of the Final Fantasy series who's grown more and more jaded and disillusioned with the franchise ever since the release of Final Fantasy X. I've long been sick and tired of the way Square Enix has milked the franchise by releasing mid to subpar quality products with the name Final Fantasy slapped on top, or characters shoehorned into unrelated products for no other reason than to increase sales revenue. With that being said, my expectations heading into Final Fantasy XVI were really low, especially after the disappointment of Final Fantasy XV, and I wasn't really impressed by the promotional material released before the game came out. I figured it was the same old song and dance of
Final Fantasy, but grittier,
and
action gameplay, but good this time,
that they've been trying to convince fans of for years now. My initial impression of 16 was that it was trying to cash in on a Game of Thrones style setting, and while they wanted combat to seem bombastic and cinematic, the trailers looked like a particle-filled mess to me and almost made it impossible to tell what was happening on the screen. It's a lot easier to get both combat and a setting filled with political intrigue wrong than it is to get it right, and with the Final Fantasy series having less than a stellar track record recently, I was really skeptical heading into 16. So imagine my surprise to find that Final Fantasy XVI actually feels like a return to the roots of the series, where the player is thrust into a high fantasy setting governed by crystals and the power of magic. The beginning of 16 really scratches that nostalgic itch by paying homage to earlier titles, yet manages to differentiate itself from the pack and stand on its own 2 feet. This is a new Final Fantasy for a new age, and they've finally taken off the kiddie gloves by incorporating scenes with more graphic violence and sexual content into the game. Now, just increasing the amount of violence and sexual content doesn't necessarily make a game better, but Final Fantasy XVI manages to make its depictions of violence integral to the plot. The few times it does toe the line of becoming gratuitous, it's used to contextualize the inner conflict, guilt, and remorse certain characters feel for their actions later, and helps their emotions feel more raw and warranted. The more sexually explicit scenes are still relatively tame by today's standards, but nonetheless, they're a little unexpected given Final Fantasy's history, and they might not be something you want suddenly popping up on screen if you have family or children around. I see how some people could think they still don't need to be included to advance the plot, but generally, I think they make the game world feel more realistic and help humanize its characters. My hope is with Square Enix finally allowing this kind of content into their flagship titles, it'll give them some more breathing room to create more titles with more mature themes moving forward. With that being said, there was part of one scene in particular with Barnabas later on in the game that felt like it could have been left out, and the game would have been better off for it. As for Final Fantasy XVI's story, I thought it was pretty decent, nothing too remarkable, but I was really surprised at the length of the main story and its side quests. This is a bit of a good and a bad thing though, because after a while, many of the side quests ended up feeling a bit too formulaic and that they dragged on a bit too long. The pacing of the main story in relation to the side quests also felt really off at times, and it can feel really awkward to go off on a side mission when the main story doesn't create enough of a gap to make doing those missions feel natural. Some side quests are also gated in some of the worst ways by the main story, with one in particular being cut off right after a declaration of imminent war, only for Clive to have to go on a cross-continental journey and fight a giant kaiju battle before he can go back and finish up the war storyline. They could have done better than that. Of course, the side content can be postponed or skipped entirely, but players are incentivized to complete them for the rewards associated with their quests. That's fine, but it doesn't make it any less awkward to ignore the main story threat looming on the horizon to drop everything and go on a scavenger hunt in the meantime. It's a little strange complaining that there's too much side content in Final Fantasy XVI, but I think having so many side quests runs the risk of burning people out when they're formulaic, fairly inconsequential and unrewarding, and not incorporated very naturally into the story of the game. In some ways, I do like the idea of using side quests to build relationships with characters that tie together toward the end of the game, but because they're so linear in Final Fantasy XVI, they just didn't resonate with me quite as much as I would have liked, and my favorite part of doing the side content was being reintroduced to the iconic monsters from previous Final Fantasies. It's always fun seeing how the monsters get reimagined in each game, and while not all fan favorites return, some enemies are better now than they've ever been. Looking back, while it's hard to say that 16 suffers from this, I do think 16 has a lot less replayability than some previous Final Fantasies due to its limited roster. Because you can't really swap out characters, there's a lot less incentive to go back through the game once you complete it, since you'll be experiencing all the same content through the same lens you had on your first playthrough. I think there were maybe 2 side quests total that had different endings depending on character choices, and quite frankly, it's not worth replaying through the entire game just to see how they differ from each other, and neither really affect anything later on either. While New Game Plus increases difficulty and arguably adds some replayability, it doesn't really add novelty to the game, which is a bit of a shame. As I mentioned earlier, I was really apprehensive about combat looking at promo materials, but I was pleasantly surprised at how much better it felt than it looked. The controls were a little unintuitive at first, partially due to the limited amount of control schemes available, and I'm still a little baffled they didn't make them fully customizable when they added more control schemes later on. Once I got used to the feel of combat though, I enjoyed it much more than I expected I would, and generally speaking, it just felt fun fighting enemies and learning when to dodge and parry their attacks. This was more true for me in the beginning of the game though, and the more familiar I became with combat, the more shallow I realized it was with how limited or ineffective some skills and attacks were compared to others. For example, aerial and combination attacks seem important at first, but they're actually used marginally at best, and it's not even worth trying to engage most enemies with aerial melee attacks. The magic burst system seems like it should do a lot of burst damage or rapidly increase the damage multiplier against staggered enemies, but it's a little clunky, and certain abilities serve that role much better later on. I discovered pretty early that it was way more effective to just spam lunge, a charged melee attack, and a charged spell attack ad nauseum until an enemy became staggered or my abilities were off cooldown. So while the game offers the player a lot of choices initially, I feel like in the practical application of combat mechanics, really presents the illusion of choice, and that combat becomes reductive very quickly, especially as you gain access to more and more iconic abilities, sadly. One thing that 16 does do much better with its action combat compared to previous titles like the Final Fantasy VII remake is that staggering enemies never gets interrupted by cutscenes, so you never run into the issue of all your hard work staggering an enemy going down the drain. Even though combat feels better than it looks, the visuals could have been cleaner, and there were times I got hit by enemies because I couldn't tell what was happening on screen. For full disclosure, I was playing on a 1080p monitor, and my capture card does make the footage look slightly worse than my recordings, so it wasn't quite this bad while playing it live, but I figure I should mention this since a sizable chunk of the player base will also be playing at 1080p, and it might affect their image quality as well. Anyway, the lack of visual clarity leads into this weird situation where you might want to back off to see what an enemy is doing, but in doing so, the pace of combat slows down to a crawl due to non-boss enemies being too passive even if they're taunted. This makes it feel simultaneously bad to button mash since it's easy to miss seeing certain enemy attacks, and bad to back off because it just needlessly drags out the fights. Healing is really plentiful in Final Fantasy XVI though, so it encourages the more button mash heavy playstyle on a first playthrough of the game, though to be fair, there are still going to be plenty of times you need to actively dodge attacks. The few times I did manage to die were very rare, and felt as though they were my own fault for being too miserly with my potions, or not noticing I was too close to a self-destructing bomb. So, aside from dying from my own hubris, combat felt a little bit too easy overall, but that may have been partially because I did all the side content I could, more or less as soon as it was available. Nonetheless, I never went out of my way to grind for experience or materials, so it was a little disappointing how little challenge there was in the base game, and the times I did enjoy combat the most were when I was severely underleveled, or when I couldn't just spam abilities and completely dumpster most enemies. One weird thing to me about combat was the lock-on function. It almost feels pointless since Clive is soft locked onto enemies anyway, and locking on in general felt a little too awkward for me without being able to bind it to the thumbsticks, so I kind of just abandoned using it altogether. This made it slightly more difficult to cycle between targets, but I didn't really have any problems because of it. I do wish we were given a little more freedom in controlling the movement of Clive's attacks while not locked on though, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. The next few things I want to talk about relating to combat pertain to Torgal and equipment. While it's nice to have a pet that can aid you in battle, Torgal is a little underwhelming and can be downright annoying at times, particularly if you're going for a death blow on an enemy and Torgal decides to juggle it like a literal clown. You can give Torgal directions, but because his moves don't really get grayed out or become inaccessible, it's kind of unclear how many command inputs can be queued at a time, and it's even less clear when certain commands are going to be effective. For example, Torgal has a command called Torgal Heal, but you'd be a fool for thinking that pressing Torgal Heal would mean that Torgal can heal you. There's this weird thing going on where your HP is lowered, but not completely depleted on the HP meter where Torgal can heal you, but it's not made very clear how exactly that interaction works. Instead, I think Torgal's healing would have made a lot more sense if Torgal could store a healing charge between each encounter if you pet him. This could make it more worthwhile to interact with Torgal throughout the game, but as it stands right now, it just feels like a cheap gimmick you do a few times when you first start playing, and virtually never do it again because it doesn't really affect anything. To add on to that, Torgal's command system being shared with the item hotbar is also a bit of a mess, and it always felt a bit awkward for me to try and simultaneously give Torgal commands while dealing with the other things in combat, so I more or less used the Torgal charm for the whole game so I didn't have to deal with controlling him. I know others wish they didn't have Torgal in the party at all due to his propensity to juggle enemies at inopportune times, and I don't really blame them. In some ways, Torgal is similar to other NPCs who can join the party and fight with you, but despite having the ability to control Torgal somewhat, he ends up feeling less impactful than these side characters. With the inclusion of the Torgal charm, I think the developers realized that it was a little too unwieldy controlling Torgal, which raises the question in my mind, why were we able to control him at all? Maybe it would have been better if Torgal gained more abilities, with players being allowed to pick and choose what techniques he can use in battle. And this brings me to my next point. Because we're limited to only having 3 accessory slots, only a few accessories which provide pseudo-mandatory quality of life fixes like the Torgal charm feel like viable options, effectively making it feel like we only have 2 or less open slots to work with. This makes the non-quality of life accessories, aka the vast majority of accessories, feel underwhelming and that only a handful are worth using. Accessories with effects like increasing a specific ability's damage by 5 to 10% or reducing cooldowns by 1 to 3 seconds are completely uninspired, and quite often they're outright worse than accessories which increase flat damage. It also didn't help that the game doesn't provide the values for how much damage an ability deals, or its base cooldowns, so you can't even make an informed decision about how much benefit an accessory is actually providing you. In some ways, I almost think it would have been better to remove accessories from the game entirely, or make them provide passive bonuses without needing to equip them at all. This would help make these items actually feel rewarding and add incentive to explore and do side quests. As it stands right now, too many accessories feel like they're useless or merely consolation prizes for completing different sections of the game, and that the devs are really struggling to come up with a satisfying reward structure for players. Speaking of things that are completely useless, let's dive into the crafting system. Except for the very beginning of the game when I was still trying to learn how everything worked, I don't think I paid any attention to what kind of materials I was gathering at all, and the only time I didn't have enough resources to craft an item was when they were arbitrarily gated behind completing certain side quests. It was kind of nice being able to upgrade armor and equipment, but as I mentioned earlier, with combat being as easy as it is, the upgrades felt negligible, so if the crafting system were scrapped entirely and players either bought their equipment, found it, or were rewarded with it in either the story or the side quests, I don't think anyone would notice that it was missing. This ties into what I was saying earlier, where it feels like the devs are really struggling to figure out a way to reward players for going through the game, so they tacked on the crafting system so they could have bosses and enemies drop additional items, completely ignoring how weird it is for things like harpies and griffins to drop 60 boar tusks after battle. I bet most players won't even realize an entire new currency is introduced in the final section of the game due to how inconsequential the resources are. The last thing I'd like to talk about combat in the non-spoiler section of the video is about the kaiju, or giant monster battles. I really liked how badass they made Ifrit look in Final Fantasy XVI, because while he's always been a bit of an icon, he's historically also been kind of an underwhelming and a bit of a fodder summon due to how early he's usually picked up in the games. So, seeing Ifrit look like he's crawled out of hell just so he could throw down with the likes of Mechagodzilla is a welcome change, and the returning cast of icons in 16 is pretty solid and respectable, though I do wish a few more icons made a return as well, but that just goes to show how well designed they are. With that being said, the kaiju battles are a little flamboyant and gimmicky, but I mean, what kaiju battle isn't flamboyant or gimmicky? They serve their purpose very well in setting a grand scene of epic proportions, and they hit all the notes one would expect of a shonen anime or manga where the protagonist must break through their limits to attain victory. It fits so well within the idea of Final Fantasy it's almost surprising it hasn't really been done before. If anything, some of these kaiju battles suffered from being too bombastic, and a few of the later confrontations felt a little lackluster in comparison to the hype and expectations established in earlier encounters. And so, while the kaiju battles seem really good on paper and have really cool cutscenes, I think they suffer in having awkward controls and even worse visuals than normal combat. It doesn't feel as bad when you're the one playing, but if you take a step back to just watch what's happening on screen, it can be a bit of a hot, particle-filled mess at times. While it's not the worst thing in the world, because the kaiju battles were so easy, victory tended to feel like a bit of a foregone conclusion, and some of the bosses felt a bit tedious due to how tanky they were, and that they dragged on a bit too long for how easy they were. It also doesn't help that there's often a steady stream of cutscenes following these boss battles, so it can take upwards of 45 minutes to an hour to start one of these battles, and then regain control of your character before you can save again. I can't believe we're at the point I can complain about there being too many cutscenes in a video game, but here we are. Maybe this is a good problem to have, but it's a little unexpected and can be a bit much if you have something else going on in your life. Now I'll be moving into the spoiler-filled section of the review, so if you want to avoid spoilers and just hear my score and final thoughts on the game, you can jump ahead to the timestamp listed on screen now. Alright. There's a lot to talk about regarding the story of Final Fantasy XVI, but a few things stand out to me. Well, I really liked how the brutality of Clive murdering Joshua was shocking, and helped characterize his anguish and guilt later on. I was a little annoyed at how their relationship played out later in the game. I didn't really mind Joshua's unexplained reappearance later, since Joshua's icon is the Phoenix, the bird that's famous for reviving from its ashes, but it did bother me how Joshua seemed to be literally avoiding Clive at certain intervals with no justification as to why, only for everyone to be nonchalant about it when Joshua does eventually return to the party. Was there a reason Joshua avoided Clive? Were some of his appearances really just apparitions conjured by Ultima to guide Clive down the path he must follow? If Ultima was really controlling the people around Clive, it would have been nice to show it off in New Game Plus or something, with apparitions of Ultima floating next to the people he's controlling. It would add some more replay value to the game beyond arbitrary difficulty increases, and help make certain characters like Annabella feel less flat. As it is now, Annabella just comes across as cartoonishly evil with the betrayal of her family, and seeing her change her mind about killing Clive would make a lot more sense if it was due to the desire of Ultima to leave Mythos alive. With that being said, I really think they knocked it out of the park with the visual design of Ultima, and looking into its cold, dead, fish-like eyes really highlights just how foreign and other he feels. There's a lot about Ultima we still don't know, but I would have liked to have learned more about the world Ultima intended to create, as well as Ultima's ties to the fallen civilization. Did Ultima previously try creating a Mythos before and fail? Is that why Ifrit Risen is broken and missing some of its limbs? Maybe the devs left it intentionally vague so they could explore it further in a prequel or DLC, but I'm really curious as to what happened with Leviathan and the destruction of its mother crystal, and in retrospect, I am a little disappointed we didn't see Ultima use either of Typhon or Leviathan's attacks in the final battle. Not to sympathize too much with the devil, but I was also curious to learn more about the kind of world Ultima envisioned without the Blight. Obviously, Ultima's desire to merge all of humanity into itself is similar to the human instrumentality project of Evangelion, but I'd like to hope Ultima's plan is a little more nuanced than that. I also think it's funny that Clive and Ultima are so quick to reject each other, since we don't even know what Ultima's ideal world is like, and Ultima might not even be aware that life can survive in the Blight like in Cid's hideout. Could you imagine Clive just walking up to Ultima and saying, "Yo, the Blight isn't even really that big of a problem. We have apples. They're sour." Only for Ultima to realize the folly of his ways? In all seriousness, I don't imagine Ultima would have changed its mind since it considers itself above humanity, but it did strike me as being a little off when Clive said that the difference between him and Ultima was that Ultima is alone. Maybe I missed something, but I thought Ultima was supposed to be an amalgamation of the consciousness of countless individuals from its original society, so it's not really alone, is it? In some ways, it would make more sense to me if Clive said the difference between them is that Clive is willing to sacrifice himself for others to make a future world that's worth living in, whereas Ultima would not. And even though it's not stated in the game, it's because of this difference that Clive is truly closer to divinity as mythos, and is thus worthy of salvation, and that the self-serving Ultima must fall from grace. The final battle with Ultima is grandiose to say the least, though to be honest, I felt like it was overshadowed by the fights with Titan and Bahamut. And while I do think the battle with Bahamut was a bit over the top, I think struggling to face Ultima even with Bahamut's aid later on helps highlight how powerful an enemy he is. Alas, as they say, comparison is the thief of joy, and the final battle with Odin also felt like it came up a little bit short for an icon fight, with Clive conveniently losing his iconic powers right before he defeats Barnabas. But man, was it cool breaking and stealing Zontet's Ken to use it back against him. I was a bit annoyed at how easily Barnabas handed Clive his ass earlier in the story, only for Clive to keep ramming his head against the wall until he finally broke through rather than actually figuring out a proper way to deal with him, but I guess in the end, a shonen game is going to shonen. This brings me to the next thing I want to talk about. Jill. Although I like that she and Clive have a meaningful relationship, I am a bit disappointed at how much of a flat character she ended up being. Despite being an icon, she's constantly treated like a fragile damsel in distress, and she kind of passively just goes along with what everybody else says. In some ways, this is understandable since she was more or less a political pawn and prisoner from a very young age and later turned into a tool of war. But with her entire character arc being centered on regaining her personhood, it was frustrating how docilely and meekly she let Clive exclude her from the group towards the end of the game. Again, while it's understandable to an extent due to everyone fearing lithification, I think if Jill said, "Screw you, Clive, I'm gonna fight for a world I can live and die for too," I think it would have advanced her own character arc and truly showed that she and Clive were unified in mind and spirit, and reinforced the main theme of the game. Maybe it was too much of a headache choreographing Jill in the last few fights of the game. I don't know, but I really do think they missed a giant opportunity for an easy slam dunk. Also, what was the deal with giving Torgal magical powers pretty much for them to only be used once to rescue Jill? I really hate when the bad guys in a movie or video game capture the good guys, only to make a big show out of executing them, and for them to get saved by Deus Ex Machina moments later. If you want a darker, grittier setting, villains need to be evil, cruel, or efficient, not comically inept. The whole prison break sequence could have been scrapped in my mind, and the game would have been better off for it. And just so I don't have to deal with the angry comments later, Torgal still could have gone Super Saiyan when they were initially captured, and Gov could have entered the fray then. I also would have liked there to have been more conflict between the nations, with each trying to capitalize on the destabilization of the other countries after the Mother Crystals were destroyed, but they ended up being surprisingly passive, with the exception of the Holy Empire of Sanbreak invading the Crystalline Dominion. Additionally, I thought it was extremely odd how indifferently Clive was treated after destroying so many Mother Crystals. Obviously, he didn't always go around announcing himself as Sid the Outlaw, but could you imagine if Osama bin Laden just showed up in your town after the attacks on the World Trade Center, offering to help restock businesses and getting rid of any pests in the local area? For as much political unrest and economic destabilization he caused, I would have expected there to be a lot more resentment shown towards Clive as he moved throughout the world, or more soldiers or assassins to be sent after him, but there were hardly any at all aside from Hugo Kupka. Much of Final Fantasy XVI's story seemed to rely on convenience. People didn't call Clive out for being a bearer despite him using magic 15 feet away from them because it would have been inconvenient for the story if they did. Joshua had an entire secret society devoted to him, and only him, who were conveniently able to gather intelligence, yet Clive, a prince of the Duchy of Rosaria and Joshua's personal bodyguard, was completely unaware of them. Yote is at the side of Joshua wherever he goes, up until it becomes inconvenient to have another character in the party. Then she gets left behind to wallow away in the infirmary in a supporting role with all the other women for the remainder of the game. Torgal gaining superpowers, Clive losing superpowers, characters joining and leaving the party, they all felt like they were done at a whim based on what was most convenient for the developers. So to give my final thoughts on the game, in some ways Final Fantasy XVI is a wonderful return to the roots of the Final Fantasy franchise, yet even though it has more mature themes, it still plays things a little too safe and ends up becoming really formulaic. Combat is fun, particularly in the beginning and the middle of the game, but the more familiar you are with it, the more simplistic it becomes, to the point it feels completely reductive at the end of the game if you're not in the boss battle. The practice, arcade, and time trial modes are welcome additions to the game, and with the various books of knowledge, it's really easy to dive back into it if you set it down and forgot what you were doing. The story isn't bad, but there are a few key points that felt like they could have improved or expanded upon, and a few of the side characters could have used some tender love and care to not feel so flat. Overall, Final Fantasy XVI suffers from a few systemic issues which hold it back from true greatness. Upgrades, crafting, accessories, and equipment generally feel as though they're just there for show. Quests seem arbitrarily time-gated and become way too formulaic by the end of the game, and replayability seems a lot lower than previous Final Fantasy titles, in part due to how linear the story and how small the party roster is. The way that I rate games is by placing them on a bell curve, with 5 being an average, fun, and enjoyable game, with 6 and above being games that stand a cut progressively above the rest, and 4 and below being for games that are progressively more and more flawed or actively predatory to the player. In my mind, a 10 is almost impossibly perfect, with there being no flaws or things that I think can be improved upon. With that being said, I'll give Final Fantasy XVI a 6 out of 10. Even though it's still fun and can be beautiful at times, the visuals and controls could use some cleaning up, and the biggest issue I have with Final Fantasy XVI is that it feels a mile wide but an inch deep. It's like the equivalent of a summer blockbuster for a video game. It's entertaining while it's there in front of you, but it's not very fulfilling. I struggled for a long time as to whether or not I should give it a 7, but I thought about how I gave the original Dark Souls a 7 out of 10, a score I'll stand by, and I honestly couldn't see myself putting Final Fantasy XVI into the same category as Dark Souls 1. While its enemy designs were great and its world building was pretty good, I don't think 16 stands on the same ground as Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy X, and if I were to strike up a conversation with a stranger, I feel as though I'd be much more likely to recommend playing these games over Final Fantasy XVI first. So before I receive a lot of hate in the comment section over my score, I want to reiterate that a 6 on my scale isn't a bad score. Final Fantasy XVI is a fun game, but there are already a ton of medieval high fantasy RPGs, and I don't think 16 really stands out that much from the pack. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review or found it insightful. Do you think my score for Final Fantasy XVI is too low? Too high? I'm curious as to hear your thoughts and scores for it in the comment section. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like or subscribe. And if you want to talk more about games, feel free to join the Discord. The link is in the video description. Last Protagonist out.